Welcome to Matt and the Macabre, a podcast about all things horror. Join us each week as we review another film, video game, story, or novel in the horror genre. Be warned, there will be major spoilers and harsh language. Listener discretion is advised.
What's up, guys? Welcome to Matt and the Macabre. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad that you're here, and happy Friday the 13th. We're finally here for our official kickoff and to celebrate the macabre merriment by taking a look at my personal favorite horror franchise, Friday the 13th. And of course, we're going to start with the original, released way back when on May 9th, 1980. And it really cannot be understated how successful this film was. It was made on a budget of $500,000 and went on to gross just under $60 million. To put that in perspective for today, that would be like making a movie for $2 million and then having it make $230 million. It was just immensely successful. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the genesis of the idea for this movie, where everything came from. I feel like it's one of those topics where so much ink has been spilled on it and so many people have spent so many hours talking about it. Just how many different ways can you come up with to say the exact same thing? The short version is Sean Cunningham was trying to get a soccer movie distributed. He thought that was going to be his next big thing. But in the meantime, he needed something to keep the lights on. He had to pay his bills. Halloween had been extremely successful a couple of years before. In fact, the most successful independent horror film until the Blair Witch Project in the 90s. And so basically Sean Cunningham figured he could do the same thing and keep his bills paid until this soccer picture that he always talks about got put out there. Of course, the soccer picture never came to fruition, and as they say, the rest is history. Friday the 13th was an immense success and spawned a franchise that people are still talking about over 40 years later. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get right into it. The film opens at Camp Crystal Lake in 1958. There's a group of counselors in a cabin around the fireplace singing the cheesy campfire songs while Claudette, the girl that we're supposed to focus on, clearly pretends to play a guitar. We get a creepy POV shot in there of somebody going into a cabin and looking over all the kids asleep in their cots. And it's just a small moment. I actually always forget about it. But when you watch it, it is creepy and it makes you feel like maybe the actual children are the ones in danger. But we real quick cut back to the counselors around the fire, and Claudette is making eyes at another boy named Barry. Of course, they're never named in the film. When they finish off the song, she mouths to him, "Come on," and sets down the guitar that she doesn't know how to play. And then the two of them walk off holding hands into the dark. They sneak into some kind of building. It's not really clear, but it's got an upper level, so maybe it's some kind of barn or something. And they start doing what teenagers do in these kind of movies. We cut back to the killer's POV, which they're going to use a lot in this movie. The kids get busted, and Barry gets up and starts to run his mouth about, "We weren't doing anything, just messing around." But then he just kind of hunches over and groans, and we see him fall to the ground, holding his stomach covered in blood. And then the killer starts going after the girl. And I've never really noticed it until I sat down to watch it for this review. But when Claudette's running back and forth, like trying to find a way out, she trips over a box and just about eats shit. It's actually really funny. And we don't see what happens to her, though. Instead, it just freezes on a frame of her screaming. And then we get this whiteout and the Friday the 13th font rushing forward and breaking through glass, and the credits begin. Of course, the music here is iconic with the sprinkled throughout, which I know is based on Kill Mom. At least that's what they say, although I've never quite been able to hear it. And you just cannot beat that little, I'll call it a musical cue. The only horror music that's probably more iconic than this is Halloween. Although the actual music itself is highly derivative of Psycho. I haven't compared sheet music, but it might be a direct copy. Speaking of the whiteout thing, I've never really noticed it before. Just, again, sitting down for this to review it and not just to enjoy it. There are a lot of whiteouts in this film. usually, especially in a horror movie, you expect to like fade to black or cut to black or something. And instead it does this weird whiteout effect that's actually kind of jarring. And we get another one going into what is present day 1979. I always assumed that it took place in 1980 when the movie came out, but later on in part 4, the final chapter, they drive by and we see Mrs. Voorhees' headstone, and it does list her death there as 1979. But anywho, we pick up with a kind of cute girl with a backpack walking into town. This is Annie. She stops by a gas station to talk to a dog and give it lovin's, which of course is mandatory, but and has some really awkward talk with a dog like she's never actually encountered one before. But in pretty quick order, she makes her way over to a diner and just asks how far it is to Camp Crystal Lake. And everyone in there just freezes. The lady behind the counter, everyone like up at the bar area, everybody in the diner just shuts up, and they all give her this quiet, like, bug-eyed stare. And this is where we will get the very first mention of calling it Camp Blood. But she's pretty quickly offered a ride about halfway there by a truck driver named Enos. Actually, he kind of gets voluntold by the diner owner to give the girl a lift. And he kind of awkwardly hits on her just a little bit before he gets interrupted by Crazy Ralph with his iconic line that I'm going to do a very poor impression of. You're going to Camp Blood, ain't ya? Love Ralph. Absolutely love Crazy Ralph. And of course, nowadays, the doomsayer or the harbinger or whatever you want to call him is a well-worn trope of horror movies that Cabin in the Woods specifically had a whole lot of fun with. He's basically just there to let everybody know that going where you're planning on going is an incredibly bad idea. So they get into Enos's truck, and I can never, ever not see this. Enos full on gets a hand full of ass cheek in each hand as he gives Annie a boost up into the truck. Creepy fucker. But anyway, as they're on their way, we get a little bit of background on Camp Crystal Lake with the boy drowning back in 57, the two kids at the beginning of the movie being killed. They've had fires. They say that one year the water was bad, which always strikes me as kind of weird because they don't elaborate on that. My guess is, I would assume being out in the woods, the camp clearly has running water. I guess it runs off well water and the well was poisoned or something along those lines. All the dialogue here is really awkward and forced, where Enos basically just spends the ride calling Annie a dumbass and mocking her. I'm an American original, and it's juvenile and it borders on hard to watch. This weird banter continues for another minute or so before Annie gets dropped off in front of the now iconic Moravian Cemetery, I'm sure I said that wrong, in Hope, New Jersey, which I really hope to make a pilgrimage to one day. And she starts to make her way down the road on foot. And at this point, we cut over to a pretty nice Ford pickup playing some painfully generic banjo-heavy bluegrass music. And this is our very brief introduction to Marcy, Ned, who largely plays the lovable goofball, and of course Jack, who's played by a young Kevin Bacon. For a long time, I thought that this had actually been his first movie role, but he'd actually already been in a few, including Animal House. They pull into Camp Crystal Lake, and we very quickly see the owner of the camp and their boss, Steve Christie, in some questionable red tube socks and cut-off blue jean shorts. Of course, he's shirtless with a red bandana around his neck, and he's hacking at a tree stump, looking like he's never touched an axe a day in his life. Knowing what I know about the setup of this movie being a whodunit, I can't make up my mind if this is supposed to be a red herring, like we're supposed to think that Steve is dangerous because the very first time we see him, he's holding an axe, or if it was just the late 70s and Steve is just a poor, unfortunate victim of that. Even my son, who's 12, walked in while I was watching this and said, what kind of man in his right mind would wear those kind of shorts? And I just had to tell him, it was the 70s. It was the 80s. Times were different. But I digress. Everybody shakes hands and introductions are made, which I've also found kind of strange because there was no email back in 79, but they've already been hired for a job. I'm not quite old enough to understand how you would get a job without ever meeting the person you're working for face to face. Was all this done through the mail and just phone calls? I guess they could have had some phone calls. I don't know. It's just one of those little things that just makes you go, which is, this series is chock full of those moments. So go ahead and be prepared now. This is also our introduction to Alice, our titular final girl, but I don't think we're supposed to know that yet. Steve barks out a few orders, sends everybody about their business, which I think he just did to be alone with Alice for a few minutes, because they've got this really weird exchange. On one hand, he's going through her sketchbook and her drawings like he's never seen them before, telling her she's very talented and very pretty. And it comes across like a nerdy dude on a power trip who desperately wants to make a move but doesn't really know how. But at the same time, they're also talking like they've got a long-term relationship that she's ready to end, and he talks her into hanging around for one more week until Friday and giving him another chance. So their relationship here is just not established very well. I don't fully understand what it is. Thankfully, it doesn't last very long because Alice is off to have a very brief and boring conversation about paint thinner with Bill, who is played by Harry Crosby, who I just recently found out, and I can't believe I didn't know this before, is the son of Bing Crosby, the famous singer and infamous shit stain of a human being. The main point of contention for the group is that Annie, the hitchhiker from the opening in present day, hasn't shown up yet. But Steve just gives some more marching orders and heads off into town. He says, I'll be back after lunch, but spoiler alert, no, he won't. He just fucks off to town, stays out at the diner and drinks coffee for like 8 hours. But the important thing for us, the audience, to take away in this moment is that Steve is driving away from the camp in a Jeep. So we do have a little scene of Brenda setting up at the archery range, and all of a sudden an arrow just whizzes right in front of her and like just kind of appears in the target next to her. And apparently behind the scenes that actually happened, and it was done by Tom Savini, legendary makeup artist. And she had no idea that he was going to do that, so her like jumping back and the look on her face, that whole reaction when the arrow hit was genuine. We cut back to Annie walking down the road, and we see a Jeep, the exact same color that Jeeve is in, drive by. Although this time it does have the rag top up. Steve didn't have a top on his Jeep, but it's very, very similar looking. So this is the first legitimate red herring of the movie. Now, if you stop and think about it for just a second, Steve was driving away from the camp. Annie is on her way to the camp, so this Jeep is obviously heading toward the camp, opposite of Steve, so it can't be him. Nevertheless, the misdirection is there, and overall, I think it's pretty well done. Annie has another short, little, cringy monologue before realizing that the Jeep has just sped past the road to go to the camp. And then the foreboding music kicks in, and she really starts to realize that something is wrong. She starts freaking out, begging the driver to stop, and the Jeep just keeps speeding down the road. So she just opens the door and hops out and rolls into a ditch. And horror movies, especially slasher movies, had this reputation, deservedly so, of just being a bunch of idiot kids who constantly make the worst possible decision. But I think in this case, Annie actually made the right call. She made a good call. And it's kind of a shame that she doesn't get away because she's very quickly chased through the woods by the killer. We have a pretty decent chase scene. Annie's limping, tripping all over the place, but she just jumped out of a Jeep going probably 40, 50 miles an hour down the road, so it's kind of earned. Not just the, bitches always be tripping over nothing. You've seen the meme. She runs off into the woods and gets into some foliage and tries to hide up against a tree, thinking maybe she lost whoever it is that's chasing her, just for the killer to pop up in the frame and run a knife across her throat with a pretty decent effect before she collapses to the ground and we go into another one of those weird whiteout transitions. Now we're back to the kids at the camp, setting up some floating dock pieces and just clowning around a little bit, having a big old time. We do get a POV shot of the killer watching them at the lake, and they push down a branch with their left hand with what looks like a big-ass class ring on it. Like that's supposed to be some kind of clue. Never mind the fact that nobody else in this cast is wearing anything even remotely close to that, but I digress. We get an extremely pointless scene where Ned pretends to drown, and we get to watch Kevin Bacon haul ass down the docks and dive in Baywatch style before they pull him out. And when Brenda goes to give him mouth to mouth, he reaches up and starts kissing her. And as I'm sitting watching all this, it occurs to me that I wonder if maybe this is where The Sandlot got that scene with Wendy Peppercorn. We cut over to Alice in a robe looking for some clothes, and there's a pretty good-sized black snake in there. She starts screaming for Bill, who's hacking at some brush outside with a machete for reasons. Bill rushes in, and pretty soon so does everybody else. It's a fun little clusterfuck of a scene that unfortunately does end with the real-life decapitation of that snake, which I think was here to let us see Bill swinging the machete, because after the fact he does hoist it over his shoulder like he's some kind of badass. Apparently the genesis for this scene is just some of the kids were staying at the camp during filming, and a snake got into one of the cabins, and so they decided to include it as something like this because it's one of those scary things that can happen at camp that doesn't include the killer. Just out of curiosity, because I'm so used to seeing that, no animals were harmed during the making of this film tag, I had to look and see if they put that in the credits, but they did not. So to their credit, at least they didn't kill that snake and then lie about it. I don't want to make it more than it is. It's nothing on par with what they do in Cannibal Holocaust by any means, but it's still a pretty shitty thing to do. But this moves right along to a scene where Officer Dorf pulls into the camp. Never heard a more appropriate name. And he's basically here to bust Ned's balls and let the kids know that Crazy Ralph from back in town has been seen heading out their direction. Personally, I feel like this scene should have been cut. All it really does is establish that Ralph is somewhere near the camp, but in the very next scene, Alice is in the kitchen cleaning up and putting away pots and things, and when she opens up the door to the pantry, Ralph is standing there with this musical sting that's supposed to make us shit ourselves. And I think it would have been better if we had not just been told that Ralph is around somewhere. I think it would have worked better if we just cut out this scene with Officer Dorf and suddenly Ralph is there at the camp. I mean, we already saw him get on his bike earlier. I don't think it's too big of a stretch for we, the audience, to fill in the blank that when he got on his bike after spouting his gospel, that he was heading to the camp. As it is, it's executed okay. It's a decent little jump scare, but of course at this point you see it coming, so I think if we didn't have that warning just 10 seconds beforehand, it would have been a lot more effective. Ralph just spouts a little more doom and gloom and Alice in the group, and then just kind of fucks off down the road. And then not much happens for a little while. Really kind of starts to drag here because the characters are just, I don't know, man. They're bland. There's really no standout. Of course, you're going to watch Kevin Bacon anytime he's on screen because it's Kevin Bacon. But just in general, they're not very compelling. They're not even given anything good to talk about. They talk a little bit just amongst themselves, shooting the shit. Jack turns on the emergency generator. And then a little bit later, he and Marcy wander off while poor Ned looks all lonely and horned up. But real quick, he comes across another cabin where somebody clearly has just walked into the front door. And so he walks in to see who's there, and we will never hear from Ned again. We follow Jack and Marcy. They talk for a little bit. Kevin Bacon gets to talk like a meteorologist for a second, which always makes me cringe. I really don't know why. Before Marcy somehow makes a nightmare about a thunderstorm where it rains blood. Incredibly boring. Before they finally wander off into a cabin together to engage in some extracurricular activities. Now we go to a scene of Alice, Brenda, and Bill, who actually can play the guitar, just hanging out in another cabin as the storm rolls in before Brenda suggests a game of strip Monopoly with a little bit of weed. We briefly cut back to Jack and Marcy in the middle of their activity where the camera pans up and we get to see that Ned is laying on the bunk above them with his throat slit, which is a fun little reveal, but it also it's always bugged me, because if you walk over to a bunk bed, you can see the top bunk. It's right there. But I guess they were just too distracted by each other to notice the grown man corpse just chilling in the top bunk. But once they finish up, Marcy makes her way over to the bathhouse, leaving Kevin Bacon alone. The character's name is Jack, but I can't not call him Kevin Bacon. And this treats us to the most iconic kill in this film, and one of the most iconic in the entire franchise, where he's laying in bed, blood starts to drip on his forehead, then a hand reaches out from under the bed, claps on his forehead, and an arrow comes up from underneath and stabs through his throat. The makeup on the prosthetic is kind of obvious, especially on the Blu-ray, where the picture's been really cleaned up, but it's still a really fun kill. It's a really good effect. Although that does also mean that Mrs. Voorhees had to be underneath that bed the entire time they were screwing each other, which is just a whole nother level of creepy. Then we follow Marcy into the bathhouse, and the killer sneaks in, Mrs. Voorhees sneaks in, while she's in a stall taking care of her business. And then we get that classic scenario where Marcy hears just a little bit of noise here and there, keeps calling out to see who's there, and of course nobody answers. She starts looking around thinking maybe Ned is playing a prank on her, and we see the shadow of an axe raise up behind her head. And she turns around, spots the killer, and she just closes her eyes and screams. She stands there and full on takes an axe to the face, which is a pretty sweet visual, but we don't linger very long. Then we cut back to the strip Monopoly game, which gets interrupted by the storm blowing the door open of the cabin, and Brenda calls the game off because she's left her windows open. I mean, it's not like she could run and close them and then come back or anything. She runs off into the storm, and then we finally catch up with Steve Christie at the diner. He's sipping coffee and chatting up the waitress Sandy, who clearly wants to break off a piece of Steve. Steve leaves the diner, goes in the storm, hops into his Jeep, and finally starts heading back to the camp after like 8 or 9 hours. Back at the camp, it's now Brenda's turn in the bathhouse, and they play a few of the same tricks that they did with Marcy here. Brenda thinks she hears something. She looks around a little bit, and we do see a hand on the shower curtain in the background, which doesn't sound like much, but the way that it's framed, it's actually pretty subtle, and it's effective that way, but they pull their punch here. In the bathhouse, nothing happens to Brenda. She just goes about her merry way. We jump back to Steve, who's now on the side of the road. His Jeep's broken down. He can't get it to start. But luckily, another police officer, not Dorf, pulls up and gives him a ride. And while that's happening, we cut back to stalk Brenda a little bit more from outside the cabin window while she lights a candle, crawls into bed with a book, but then hears something outside again. It's hard to make out at first, but within a few seconds, it definitely sounds like a woman or maybe a kid yelling, "Help me." So she gets out of bed, grabs a flashlight, heads out into the storm, and then at this point, we clearly yell somebody yelling for help. I'd be curious to know who exactly is doing the yelling, because I have a hard time picturing Betsy Palmer doing this voice. It sounds more like a kid to me than a younger woman. Brenda's wandering out in the rain, and suddenly somebody cuts all the spotlights on, and we see that Brenda is standing in the middle of the archery range, which is a nice callback now that I say that out loud. But then we just hear Brenda scream as we cut back to the cabin where Alice is hanging out. Bill bursts through the door, tells Alice the generator's okay. She says that she heard a scream and that someone turned the lights on at the archery range, but Bill never heard anything, and when they look, the lights are back off. Alice says it sounded like Brenda, so they decide to go take a look. They wander around in the storm, call for Brenda, walk into a cabin, and Bill finds an axe with a little bitty blood stain on it tucked into a cot like it's going nighty-night. I've never been able to figure this out. They wander into another cabin over to the bathhouse. Of course, they don't find anybody. Then they very smartly decide to call for help. I don't know what made them take so long to make that decision. They head over to the main office, but it's locked. They grab a board and bust in the window. Like, they're making good decisions at this point. And I do actually like this shot because as they get inside the cabin and they're rummaging around, trying the phone, trying the payphone, which both are dead, The camera is outside the cabin and following the phone line along the building to show us that it's been cut. And then they try to use Jack's truck to, I guess, go track down Steve at the diner, but it won't start, so they just head back into a cabin. Speaking of Steve, we go back over to him with the officer that picked him up, and the officer, he bitches a little bit about it being Friday the 13th and a full moon, and they talk a little shit about Crazy Ralph, but he gets a call on the radio of a really bad accident and has to go ahead and just drop Steve off a little early in the middle of this storm. Steve makes his way to the entrance of the camp and gets blinded by somebody holding a flashlight, and he has his, "Oh, hi, what are you doing out in this mess?" and takes a couple of steps forward and just, lurches over. I'm actually a little upset about that because Steve was a douche. We should have seen just a little bit more gore for him. Then we cut to the room where the generators are in because our killer is shutting it down and the entire camp goes dark. Bill lights a couple of lanterns and goes to check it out and tells Alice just to stay in the cabin and try to get some sleep. And at this point, I realize Bill deserved better. He's made mostly the right decisions. He didn't bother anybody. He was quiet and out of the way, and the only guy that didn't make an ass of himself, between Ned just acting like a complete goofball and Kevin Bacon's weird meteorology talk, maybe that's why Bill was the last one alive. Maybe that's why he made it as long as he did. Bill wanders over to the generator room to check it out, and the whole time he's checking it out, the door that he came in is standing wide open. And in the shot, it's behind him and just to the side in the frame, which is actually really effective because it draws your attention. You're constantly watching there and waiting for somebody to show up, and nobody ever does. It's one of those tricks that the original Halloween pulled to build up suspense, like, oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, but then it doesn't, and just kind of build that up and make you want more. We cut over to Alice. She wakes up screaming for Bill and gets up and is immediately calm. We get this long, continuous shot of Alice making coffee. We walk through the whole thing, lighting the burner on the stove, putting the water on. There's no music here, and I can't really tell if that helps or hurts because you're waiting for something to happen. Maybe for Bill to come back or for something bad to happen. I don't know if it's that you're expecting it or you're just wanting it at this point. I don't know. Without a score underneath it, it feels a little aimless. There's no tension at all, but I can't really tell if that's what they were going for or not. But pretty soon she gets tired of waiting, grabs a lantern to go out looking for Bill herself, and she finds his poncho in the generator room, but there's no sign of Bill. At least not until she steps back out and closes the door to the generator room, where we see Bill hanging there from a bunch of arrows stuck in his body with his throat slit for good measure. And at this point, the music kicks in, and Alice is running for her life, screaming bloody murder. No pun intended. She goes back to the main cabin they've been hanging out in, tries to barricade it shut with a rope that's tied around a rafter, which actually looks like it might have worked. But then she sets up a couple of fire logs and some other just random bullshit in front of the door, which doesn't make any sense because the door opens outward, not inward. So I guess maybe her thought was if they get the door open, they'll trip over all that shit on their way in. I don't know. But she picks up a baseball bat, kind of steels herself, and gets ready to make her stand. But it's actually pretty funny because all of this effort is for nothing. She wanders over into the kitchen. She's looking out all the windows. You can see the wheels turning. What am I going to do? And then all of a sudden, from a window behind her, Brenda's body gets flung inside, which just makes me realize that Mrs. Voorhees had to be an incredibly, physically strong woman. It's hard to tell how Brenda was actually killed because she's just got some blood smeared on her face, and for some reason there's a rope wrapped around her upper body. Not like she was hung from it, but like it's wrapped up around her like an X. I don't know, it's weird. But then she sees the headlights of a Jeep outside and runs out there thinking it's Steve. But it's actually Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, which I just realized means that Mrs. Voorhees was playing a really fucked up game of Ding Dong Ditch. Because that means she had to throw Brenda's body through the window and then immediately run off to the Jeep where it was far back enough that the headlights were like pulling into the camp. So I don't know. Do with that what you will. Mrs. Voorhees introduces herself as an old friend of the Christies, Steve's family, which apparently some people believe had to be a lie. I personally have never thought twice about it. I've just always taken it at face value. I mean, at the very least, she was working at the camp as a cook when Jason drowned, so she had to know the Christies in some capacity. I'm not going to make a mountain out of a molehill here. This is where Alice is freaking out, trying to explain everybody's dead, and she's just in a total panic, and Pamela's just trying to calm her down. And at this point, I will address what I guess is the primary controversy of this movie. Was it or was it not a cheat in a whodunit to hide the fact that there was another person at the camp? Because typically in a whodunit, you've got your victims and your possible suspects. Everybody's there. But in Friday the 13th, the one most important piece of information that they hide from us is that there's another person at the camp. And that somebody that we don't know is the one who turns out to be the killer. I'm kind of ambivalent, really. It doesn't really bother me one way or another. I do think it's a cheat. It could definitely be interesting to see a version where Mrs. Voorhees is there the entire time, and we have the opportunity to at least guess that it's her before it's revealed. But I think the way that it's presented as is just fine. Maybe that's because that's just how it's always been, but I've never really had an issue with it. But Mrs. Voorhees, she goes in to investigate, or pretend to investigate, and looks at the mess and Brenda's dead body. And this is where we get the history of the camp with Jason drowning, and she very quickly starts to lose her shit. And we see that she's crazy, quite literally talking to her dead son. But see, I think the one thing that gets missed here is everybody always says that she was killing to avenge Jason's death. That's what the killings at the very beginning of the movie were about for sure. She straight up says, though, I couldn't let them open this place again. Pamela Voorhees is not killing at this point to get revenge. She's already got that. She is killing to protect more children, which I think really should have been driven home more, because as a motivation, that is, I mean, it's something different. It's very interesting. It's something that you could have really played with. But at this point, there's not a whole lot to say about the next 5 or 6 minutes of the movie. Maybe it wasn't typical then, but now it's a typical slasher chase scene. Alice tries to escape in the Jeep, but Annie's body's in there, so she runs into another cabin and shuts off the lights, which was actually really stupid because the lights were already on. So even though she thinks she's hiding, cutting those lights off actually calls attention to herself. Steve's body falls out of a tree with a knife in his chest, and the whole time Pamela's just stalking her. I really want to give credit to Betsy Palmer at this point because, yeah, the acting's a little hokey and it's a little over the top, but she sells me on the fact that this lady is unhinged. At the very least, I have no trouble believing that this woman is dangerous. And I think that can be hard to pull off, especially at that time. But there is some really good stuff in this chase sequence where Alice kind of gets ahead and then slips behind some brush. And it's a little Scooby-Doo because Pamela Voorhees keeps going and Alice just doubles back the other way. But that's when she gets into a cabin and shuts the lights off, which again was the dumbest thing she could have done because every light in the camp was on. So of course, Mrs. Voorhees immediately goes to that cabin when she shuts the lights off. But Alice hides in the pantry, and there's a shot where she's ducked down hiding, and just above her head behind her, you can see that the doorknob slowly starts to turn before Mrs. Voorhees starts to rattle it, really trying to get in there. And of course, this whole thing culminates with a wrestling match on the beach, which is kind of goofy, and it does give me flashbacks to fight scenes in Star Trek, the original series. But I do want to point out that they had no stunt people on this movie. They couldn't afford them. So Betsy Palmer and Adrienne King are both really rolling around on this beach. Adrienne King really got her face slammed into the ground and kept right on trucking. So I do definitely think they deserve some credit for that. But Alice gets a hold of the machete and relieves Mrs. Voorhees of her head in what is probably one of the most iconic shots in horror film history. And with the killer finally killed, Alice slips into a canoe and glides out onto the lake for reasons. And wakes up in the morning. It's supposed to be just this scene of tranquility, like everything is okay. There's some uplifting music playing. The police are showing up. And once the police show up, then you're safe. Everything is okay. By the way, something I never really noticed until I sat down again, I guess because I'm sitting down to review it and not just have fun. Where in the holy hell did the cops come from? I mean, we saw that the phone line was cut, so none of the counselors at the camp called. The officer that drove Steve never made a mention of coming back to check on him. It's a genuine what the fuck moment because it comes completely out of nowhere. The best that I can come up with is maybe that same cop the next morning was patrolling and saw that Steve never picked up his Jeep, so went to check on him. But even that's a little bit of a stretch, but that's all I got. Right in the middle of this peaceful, tranquil scene, all of a sudden, young Jason pops up out of the lake and drags Alice into the water, which I think will forever be this first movie's legacy. But it's so well done. Like I don't want to oversell it, but I definitely want to sell it. There's no build-up or suspense to it. The music isn't building up. We're at the end. You know, the cops are calling out for her. She's totally fine. The music doesn't swell or fade. It's this nice, peaceful, tranquil piece of music. And Jason just interrupts it in the middle, and it's very, very well framed and executed. And they're gonna try a few times to recreate the magic of this moment later on in the series, and they're going to fail every single time. Probably hardest in part 3, but we'll get there when we get there. In the next shot, Alice wakes up screaming in the hospital, so it was just a dream, which is another kind of a cheat. But it was so well done that it's really hard to hold it against them. And I don't think at the time the it's a dream thing was as cliched as it is now. But she asked the officer if they found the boy. They tell her they never found one. And she says really softly, "He's still there." And then the camera goes back to the surface of the lake and slowly zooms in and fades to black and the credits roll. And there you have Friday the 13th, which kicked off a franchise spanning 40 plus years, 12 movies, a handful of video games and books and comics. And it all started with this little rinky-dink independent movie that was made just to try to keep the bills paid while they were trying to get something else out. Overall, as my final thoughts on the film, it definitely deserves its place in the horror echelon. It's not a perfect film by any means. In fact, you could make a pretty good case that it's not even a great film. It's got some issues, some things that just don't make sense. The acting, with the possible exception of Betsy Palmer, is subpar. The movie is dark overall. I mean, physically dark, which you really notice later on in the film when they're wandering around the woods in the dark. It's hard to see what's going on and to know what we're supposed to be looking at and focusing on. But overall, it's fairly well made. Some of the misdirections that they do, especially with the Jeep, I think is clever. And it's fun to watch when you have that mindset of where are they trying to trick me? And for me, at the end of the day, my opinion on a movie largely comes down to, did I have a good time watching it? And I absolutely did. I can give this movie a solid recommendation with no reservations. Make it a part of your yearly Halloween rotation. And if you have somehow gone the last almost 45 years without seeing it, definitely take the time and check it out. Well, that about does it for our look at Friday the 13th. Well, actually, that's not true because there is a novelization to talk about. There are a handful of novelizations by Simon Hawke, but they weren't put out until later on in the 80s. Part 3 actually has 2 different adaptations, one by Simon Hawke and another by Michael Avallone, and I apologize if I butchered that name. And I don't think these things get talked about nearly enough, and the truth is that they're hard to get a hold of nowadays. I saw a copy of the novelization of the first movie on Amazon for $399. But most of them go on eBay for anywhere from $70 to $150, depending on what kind of shape they're in. Michael Avallone's adaptation of Part 3 was actually the first one that was released. It was done in 1982 to coincide with the release of the movie. Later on, Simon Hawke wrote Parts 1, 2, 3, and 6. I believe 6 was actually the first one written and released. Then, of course, way later, we got a novel of Jason X, which spawned a mini series of its own. and Freddy vs. Jason, of course. And then there are a handful of books just tied to the Friday the 13th franchise as a whole. Just to kind of preview my thoughts on all of them, I don't think they really warrant an entire episode. I mean, they're novelizations. It's basically the movie put on the page. But I do think they warrant a little bit of talk. There are some interesting things in there. So for the movies that have adaptations, we're going to wrap up each episode talking just briefly about that novelization. And this one was written by Simon Hawke, published in 1987. Jason Lives was actually the first one that came out the year before. And there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It's pretty straightforward. I will definitely say they should have spent money on an editor because there are typos and misspellings and run-on sentences galore in this thing. But it's a pretty standard novelization. It really is largely just the movie put on the page. But there are some fun little things in there, like we get to learn about a little more about Ralph and Officer Dorff and how Dorff feels like a real policeman when he gets to use his radio and with his leather holster. And we also find out that there are only 4 officers on the Crystal Lake PD, and that Dorff's dream is to become an officer in a big city like New York or LA. He's got a real like Dirty Harry complex. We find out that Annie's big dream is actually the opposite, is to leave the city and just go out to a log cabin or a little house in the country, which is why she takes these camp jobs every summer as a cook, because it gets her out in the woods, and being the cook pays a little bit better than just being a counselor. And we even find out that the dog that Annie stopped to pet at the beginning of the movie has a name. His name is Winslow, and he's a good boy, but he doesn't get much attention, which is really sad. Speaking of Annie, with her introduction, I just have to point this out because I got a kick out of it when I read it. Even Simon Hawke calls out Enos grabbing a handful of Annie's ass when he helps her into the truck. And I know that's a really small thing that I'm making bigger, but it makes me feel validated because, like I said, when I watch this movie, I can never not see it. And the fact that even the novelization calls it out, I don't know, it makes me feel a little vindicated. Let me just read you this real quick. Quote, "He gave her a boost with a hand on her rear as she climbed up. For a moment, Annie wondered if he was copping a quick feel, but she decided to forget it. He seemed reasonably harmless like crazy old Ralph, and it probably made his day. In any case, it beat walking 10 miles. Wow, I have a hard time picturing a line like that flying nowadays. But you do get to find out a little bit more about each character. We find out that Ned was actually an honor student, which is how he got the truck. It was a gift from his dad. And once the summer's over, he's heading off to UCLA. Jack and Marcy are basically trying to have one last fling before the summer's over because they're going off to 2 different colleges in different states. And even though they're talking about trying to keep it going, they both kind of realize that, you know, they're realistic about the fact that it's probably not going to last. And we do get a little bit more about Steve and Alice. According to the book, they are a couple. They're trying to work things out between them, even though we're never really told what that means. But the reason that things are so awkward between them is because Alice just wants Steve to pack up, let the camp thing go, and he wants to prove, not just to her, but to everybody, that there's not a curse on the camp or his family, because apparently this camp ruined his father, and he's just too stubborn to pack up and go elsewhere. But I don't know, man. Just, you draw very well, and you're very pretty. It's so fucking, it bothers me. But I don't buy the story that we're fed in the book. Partly because just a few pages after this, we find out that Alice is basically seeing 2 dudes at once. The other guy's name is John, and both John and Steve are waiting on her to make a decision. And her issue is, quote, neither of them was willing to give up his own interest for hers, but each expected her to give up her interest for his sake, unquote. And we find out that Alice was basically taking a break from John when she met Steve, and just this whole thing is just muddled and unnecessary, and I just, personally, I don't care for it. We also get more about Jack and Marcy, mostly from Jack's point of view, where he's thinking about the possibilities of their future together, especially if she were to get pregnant, where it suddenly takes just this weird turn to a mini monologue about his view on abortion and wanting to be a part of the decision. And I've got mixed feelings about this because on one hand, I applaud Simon Hawke for attempting to address a heavier issue in here and, give the characters real stories, real circumstances, make the story about something more than just kids go to camp horny and high and get killed. But at the same time, stuff like this especially, is so quick. It comes and goes so fast that it almost comes across as half-assed, and I just don't think that we need it. It never goes beyond Jack talking to himself. He never talks about it with Marcy. It never gets any more screen time, so to speak, and nothing even remotely close to this was presented in the movie, so I don't think it should have been included in the book, but that's just me. So the book, all in all, it does attempt to make the characters a little more sympathetic, attempt to flesh them out just a little bit. But one thing that he does with a character that I absolutely hate is with Mrs. Voorhees, with Jason's mom. We get just a little bit of extra backstory for her from the time that Jason drowned. How she, after Jason drowned, stayed on at the camp. She basically begged Mr. Christie, Steve's dad, to stay on just so she could keep her mind occupied, which makes sense on one hand, but the way it's delivered in the book is like, even though she was trying to keep her mind occupied, that also kept her mind on Jason, and this anger and rage built up, and so she killed the two counselors at the beginning of the story back in 58 for revenge, which, goes along with what's in the movie and her pathos the way that I see it. But in the modern day, according to the book, she is still bent on revenge. They all need to be punished. All the kids need to be punished. But that is not what Betsy Palmer sells in the movie. Now, I will be the first to admit that, like the vast majority of theories you can form about this franchise, you can tear that theory down with lines that Mrs. Voorhees says to Alice about, you let him drown, you weren't paying any attention, look what you did to him. But I still maintain that it was about protecting the children. We've seen that Mrs. Voorhees is obviously nuts. She's literally talking to herself as Jason in a little kid's voice. I think in this moment, she has just completely snapped with reality. And you will never convince me that she was killing this entire set of counselors for revenge. She was killing this set of counselors because she tried everything she could to keep the camp from opening. It just wasn't enough, so now she has to employ very drastic measures, in her mind, of course. And in the movie, Betsy Palmer very much had me believe that she did what she did to protect other children. She got her revenge back in 58 when she killed those two counselors, and after that, with the fires and poisoning the water, she was trying to keep the camp from opening, to keep what happened to Jason from happening to any other children. She was trying to protect more kids. I know I'm hammering this over and over again, but it's very important, in my opinion. I think this very much comes across in the movie, and it's not all about revenge, and that is what makes Pamela Voorhees stand out. It's what makes her not just a typical bent on revenge, crazed killer. So the fact that the book completely shits on a really sympathetic characterization pisses me off more than a little bit. It's the one thing in here that I absolutely hate. But outside of that, and the little character moments that we get, just, because it's a book and we have time that we don't have in a movie, although not really, because it's only 116 pages long. I mean, you can read it in one sitting. But I think if you get your hands on it, go ahead, why not? If you're a fan of the series especially, I think it's worth going through just to kind of get a little kick out of. It's definitely not worth spending $200 or $300 on. But if you were to, say, stumble across it on some kind of archive on the internet, some kind of organization, wink, 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 then yeah, go for it. So that will do it for this episode of Mad on the Cob, but that won't do it for Friday the 13th. As a direct response to the massive success that this movie enjoyed, a sequel was released less than a year later. Just shy, actually. This film came out May 9th, 1980, and Friday the 13th Part 2 was released on May 1st, 1981. And that is what we will be talking about next time. Until then, you kids keep your noses clean, understand? We ain't gonna stand for no weirdness out here.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Mad and the Macabre. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Join us next episode as we take a look at another piece of the wonderful world of horror. Mad and the Macabre is not affiliated with, and this podcast has not been prepared, approved, or licensed by any entity that created the media analyzed herein. Music is a horrid discovery by Ayla Scott, licensed under a Creative Commons license. If you enjoyed the show, support us by leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, and join us over at patreon.com/madandthemacabre for exclusive content. We'll see you next time.